All right, hey guys, just a few notes here on the first page. Remember that there is no international trade for the AP exam this year, so you don't have to worry about those pages or that content. We will be talking about the Phillips curve probably in the video tomorrow. I think a couple people had asked about questions to the multiplier quiz, so I'll go ahead and go over that. So the multipliers, MPS always goes on the bottom, and that's kind of the savings rate, and that'll be true in the monetary policy unit as well. The amount that the bank has to save, what is the reserve requirement rate, it goes on the bottom. So for the spending multiplier, it's 1 over MPS. For the taxing multiplier, MPS still goes on the bottom, but it's negative MPC. So A is the correct answer for 1. And then because MPS equals 1 minus MPC, that makes this true. 1 over 1 minus MPC if we, substitute that in. If the MPC is 0.5, the MPS is also 0.5, so that is 2. Spending will always be positive. If the MPS is 0.5, what is the spending multiplier? So the MP 1 over 0.5, that still makes it 2. What is the taxing multiplier of MPC is 0.25. So MPS would be 0.75, so that would be negative 1/3. And the taxing multiplier is always negative. Now the balanced budget multiplier is always equal to 1. And that is because, so BBM equals 1, because it's equal to the taxing multiplier plus the spending multiplier. So if the spending multiplier is 10, then that means the taxing has to be negative 9. So for example, with an MPS of 0.1, 1 over 0.1 would equal 10 for the spending multiplier, and negative 0.9 over 0.1 would be negative 9. And that 10 plus negative 9 gives us 1. So spending is more powerful than taxing, right? Because if we absolute value both, that 10 is greater than 9 in terms of power. And the taxing multiplier is always negative because if you increase taxes, it's going to have a negative impact on GDP, and that's where that negative comes in from. So the balanced budget multiplier simply just adds those two together. So if the government decides to increase spending by 100, so I'm just going to keep track of that plus, and the MPS is 0.1, what is the total increase in GDP? So 1 over 0.1, which would be 10, means that the GDP would increase by 1,000. Okay, so any new money spent, which is the $100 increase in spending, is going to be multiplied 10 times, so we get that. So then that is the equation that we would use, or the side of the equation we'd use to figure out, well, how much is that going to change GDP by? So in question number 8, we want to boost GDP by 100. So that's equal to, in this case, the balanced budget multiplier, but whatever the multiplier is times the change in whatever that is. So if this is the taxing multiplier, that's going to be the change in taxes. If it is the spending multiplier, then it's the change in spending. Now for the balanced budget multiplier, it's 1. So 100 equals 1 times the change. And that change for the balanced budget multiplier is the increase in both taxes and spending. So they're going to need to increase spending and increase taxes by $100. And that net effect will be to increase GDP by 100. And I'll show you the math behind it here. So let's use, we said before, the spending multiplier is 10. So if we increase spending by 100, times that by a spending multiplier of 10, and we add to that an increase in taxes of 100 times the negative 9 taxing multiplier, we're going to add $1,000 in GDP from the spending, and we're going to subtract $900 from spending because of the taxing effect, and that net impact is going to be that positive 100 that we want. So once you kind of see the connection, whatever the GDP gap is for the balanced budget multiplier, you just simply need to increase spending and taxing by that amount. Number 9, if there's a recessionary gap of 1,000, so we want to increase GDP by 1,000, and the MPC is 0.5, what would the increase in spending have to be So 1 over 0.5 gives us a multiplier of 2, because if the MPC is 0.5, the MPS is 0.5. So 2x means that we'd have to increase spending by 500. And then lastly, if there's an inflationary gap, so we want to decrease GDP by 1,000, and the MPC is 0.5, what would the, in this case it should be, change in taxes need to be? So the taxing multiplier would be negative 0.5 over 0.5, which is negative 1. So we would need to increase taxes by $1,000 to reduce the inflationary gap of 1,000. So a lot of these use that kind of basic equation of the change in GDP equals the multiplier times whatever the change is going to be. And again, use the taxing multiplier, use change in taxes. Use the spending multiplier, change in spending. So if the government passes a $3 billion spending bill to buy police cars, why might AD increase by more than $3 billion? Simple. Multipliers. Or the spending multiplier. If Congress needs to close a $500 billion inflationary gap, so we want to decrease GDP, that side of the equation, by $500 billion, the MPS is 2/3, what would the government need to increase spending by? So the spending multiplier would be 1 over 2/3, because that's the MPS. So then that would be 3/2 x, and this is spending. So it would be, I think it ends up, I don't want to use my calculator. I'm pretty sure it's negative 333, because then 3/2 times 3 would be 9/2. Yeah. So we want to decrease, and again, this is decrease spending by. If Congress needs to close a $500 billion recessionary gap, so we want to increase GDP by $500 billion, what would the government need to change taxes by? So negative 1/3, because that's MPC, over MPS would mean that would be negative 1/2. And so the government would actually need to decrease taxes by 1,000 billion, or 1 trillion, because that would be 500 divided by 1/2. Then, if Congress wants to close a real recessionary gap of $100, but doesn't want to run a deficit, so that is a key in on, they're going to use the balanced budget multiplier, because that's what you would do if you didn't want to run a deficit. So we would just simply increase spending and finance that increase in spending by increase in taxing by the recessionary gap of 100. Number 5, so kind of connecting, if potential GDP is 100, so our potential comes from the LRAS curve, right? And current GDP is 50, so we're in a recession. And that's a recessionary gap. We want to boost GDP by $50. How would you close the real GDP gap? By increasing spending if the economy measured MPC of 0.9. So 1 over 0.1 would be 10. So we want to increase spending by $5 to close the gap. Then lastly, number 6, suppose government reduces taxes by $20 billion and the MPC is 3/4. What is the effect on GDP? So now we're searching for this side of the equation. What's the impact of decreasing taxes by that amount? Negative MPC over MPS would be a negative 3. So that would boost GDP by 60 billion. And so there's the answer key for those problems. Then one of my favorite pictures of the year, because I drew this, as you can tell. So with the reserve requirement, that is the percentage of money that the bank has to keep in required reserves and has to keep on hand in the vault. So if a $100 new deposit comes in, $25 goes in the vault, 75 goes out in excess reserves and can be loaned out. So if that loan, and this is where the banking industry is very confusing. The bank can do a lot of things with its excess reserves. We assume, for simplicity's sake at this level, that the banks just loan out all their excess reserves. So this loan goes to somebody else who buys something with it, and that goes into bank 2, who has to hold 25% in reserve, 75% goes out in loans, and so on and so forth. So very similar to the spending multiplier, that As you spend more and more money, that gets kicked around circular flow, so that money becomes income for somebody else, and then they have more money to spend, then they have more jobs and more money as income, and so on. Same thing in the banking system. So the multiplier for banking is 1 over the reserve requirement, which is, again, that idea that in every equation for the multipliers at these levels is it is the savings rate always goes on the bottom. For the Keynesian multipliers in fiscal policy, it's MPS. That's the percentage saved. For banks, it's the reserve requirement. So 1 over 0.25 is 4. So in terms of money creation, and I think I covered that in another video, and if you have questions, just leave it on the forum for today, that the amount of money that can be created is the multiplier times the initial excess reserves. So how much money can be created through this new $100 coming into the bank would be 300. Because when this person borrows the $75, now there's a new $75 that didn't exist before. This person still has 100, but this person now has 75. So in total, we've created in this first round of banking $75. So in total, if we kept going through bank 2, bank 3, bank 4, and so on, we'd end up with $300 created through the loan process. So as we look at the next problem where it's 50%, so $50 goes in the vault, $50 in excess reserve, 1 over a half is 2. So the multiplier is going to end up creating less money. So during a recession, we would want to use lower reserve requirements, and during higher inflation, to create less money, we would raise the reserve requirement. Now, the Fed has rarely touched this number because it's their nuclear option, which kind of tells you that in terms of monetary policy is they're pushing it to the limit, because currently the Federal Reserve is requiring a 0% reserve requirement. So if I go through here, erase all this stuff. The Fed currently, and this shows us kind of the extreme times we're in economically speaking, and the Fed's power, if you remember from the IB stuff of evaluation, is in deep recessions, monetary policy really doesn't work, especially by itself. So if there's a 0% reserve requirement, $0 has to go in the vault, which means the bank now can loan out all of that money. So that goes into bank 2, who has to hold $0 in the vault and can loan out all 100. Now that doesn't mean, because you might remember the phrase liquidity trap, that doesn't change the fact that either the banks don't have to loan that money out if they don't find anybody who seems reliable enough to loan the money to, or there may not actually be people walking into the bank looking to borrow that money, even though there's more and more loanable funds available. This will be the last page I work on today, and then tomorrow I'll start covering the Phillips curve stuff that comes up next. So in your own words, what's the reserve requirement? Well, it's the savings or percentage that has to go in the vault, percentage that can't be loaned out, something like that. How do banks create money? Loans. Why do people borrow money? There's lots of reasons. Mr. Nello has always said there are 5 reasons why an individual should borrow money. Number 1, many of you hopefully won't have to, but your education. And again, these have to be done in moderation to some extent, so it's not just like, education, just borrow money for education for any reason, but education being one reason to borrow money. Second reason is buying a house or some sort of housing unit, so if it's a condo, if it's a townhouse, whatever. And again, within limits, that doesn't just mean borrow as much money as you can. Borrow money for a car, because many people have to. You can't, you could pay cash for a car and save some money in terms of interest, but a car would be an okay. If you're going to start a business, and again, within limits, but that would be an acceptable reason to borrow money, so that way, hopefully, that business is successful and you have more money in the future. And then lastly, emergency. If you need to borrow money because of some emergency that comes up, you're just going to have to do it. But hopefully you set yourself up financially that you don't have to worry too much about that. So if people borrow more money, what happens to GDP? It goes up, because that becomes new spending. And the formula for the multiplier is 1 over the reserve requirement. So, great. Starting off 1 over 1, and so I want to say it's like 7.5, but It's too early for me to do the math. I don't have my calculator out. All right, 6 2/3. That would be the money multiplier. If the Fed buys $10,000 worth of Treasury bonds and the reserve requirement is 0.15, how much money can the banking system create? How much will the total money supply have increased after all banks? So now this gets into two different concepts. So the Fed, this money exists, right? So $10,000 times the 6.67, because we just did that, means that the total money supply is going to be, I'm just going to round, at 67,000. So that's the total amount of money. Now, the answer to both of these questions is 67,000 because money at the Fed isn't money. Money at the Fed is outside of circulation. So it's not the same thing as somebody coming in to borrow the money or to put it in a demand deposit account in a bank. When the Fed buys bonds, that is increasing the money supply because money at the Fed is not money. So the answer to both of these questions is 67,000. If an individual walks into a bank with $10,000, the total money supply is going to be 67,000 based on this problem, but only 57,000 of which is going to be created because that $10,000 that I walked in the bank with was money before. So those are the difference in those kinds of questions. So if they moved the multiplier from 0.15 to 0.2, that would mean the multiplier would be 5. And by raising the reserve requirement, that would be contractionary because less money would be created. If the Fed sells $20,000 worth of Treasury bonds, well, how much will the money supply decrease? So 20,000 times 0.5 would mean that the economy would contract by $100,000. So again, just using the multiplier to make those calculations. And then lastly, so we want to increase the money supply by $20 billion with the reserve requirement of 0.1, which would make the multiplier 10, which means that the Fed would need to buy $2 billion worth of bonds to close that gap because any money is going to be multiplied by 10.